Hi, in this video we are going to prepare and pad stitch your undercollar and sew it onto your half scale jacket. So the first step is to grab your pieces. I am using a wool fabric. I have also my canvas here. Both have been cut on the bias as indicated by my pattern piece. They have 1/2 inch seam allowances, and there are some notches and some matching points to be mindful of. So this is going to be this little point here where it does detaches from the jacket and then goes off on its own. So you want to make sure that you get that marked when we get to the stage where we need it. And then I have done a machine sewn side and a hand sewn side, and I did it with 2 different ways to show different ways you can hand stitch that. And so let's get started. So the first step you're going to do in order to prepare these is you are going to mark your seam allowance, or make sure you're aware of your seam allowances. So I have my 2 pieces of canvas here, and I just want to make sure that I mark my 1/2 inch seam allowance on these 2 pieces. Now if I overlap them the way I'm actually going to be not butting it together like that, because that would only be a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're actually going to be overlapping them seam allowance on top of seam allowance. So you're actually overlapping them 1 inch. So if you go ahead and just mark 1 inch, it will make joining them together a little easier. So like for example, so if I had a 1/2 inch seam allowance, that's where my seam allowance would be. And so if I line those up, those 2 1/2 inch seam allowances on top of each other, then that gives me a 1 inch overlap. Okay, so that's what you're looking for, is to get that 1 inch overlap and to make sure everything's aligned. So I'm just going to pin it right down the middle, there and there. So if it's not showing, then it's not quite right. Okay, so just like this, and then you're going to keep this flat because canvas is stiff, you're actually just going to sew right down here, and that's how you're going to join these 2 pieces. So we do this to keep it on the bias, and then that way it'll have its roll line going around when it's on. Then this one actually just gets sewn together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, and then you'll press it flat. I've placed it in my machine so that I'm going to be back stitching first. So I'm about 1 centimeter in, and I'm going to back stitch to my edge, and then I'm just going to sew right down my center back seam and back stitch at the other end. Okay. So, and then I'll take that to the ironing board and press it flat. So like this. Okay. If it's really bulky, you can trim this down to a 1/4 inch. And then on this one, I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides of that stitching line. So I can also trim this one down, and I'm also going to back stitch. Now you can zigzag stitch this, or you can straight stitch this. I'm just going to go down one side of those pins and back stitch. And then instead of cutting it and taking it out, I'm just going to rotate it and place it back in. Again, back stitching. And then taking that out. Okay, and then if this is bothersome, you can trim that off. Down to 1/8 of an inch from where you've sewn it. Stitch it a little bit closer to that side, so it's already 1/8 of an inch. So that's my canvas, and then this one is my undercollar. And so this can also be cut out of fashion fabric instead of Melton, or in my case I just used any wool I had. So I'm just going to place this on the ironing board. I'm using a bit of steam to flatten it and let the iron's heat do its work. Might as well do that one too, because I could see that I stretched it a little bit. Okay. And then these two will fit together. I can place it like this, or it does have to fit on here, right? And then I'm going to baste this in place on my roll line, so I need to mark my roll line. You're going to take your pattern piece and this is your roll line template, and you're just going to set them on top of each other. It doesn't quite reach over here, but you basically want to follow this curvature and line that up, and then this becomes your roll line. Okay, so you're going to do that with your canvas as well. Basically, that's how this piece fits on there. It's just like this, and then taking your pen or marker, that will become your roll line, and then that's where you're going to baste it to your to each other. You're going to baste the canvas and the Melton together. Okay, so that is where they attach, and then the collar will be pad stitched, and it will curve like this and attach to the jacket like that. So we don't have much of a roll line. Made this real low, so we're gonna have a very narrow roll line there and a very narrow collar. Okay, so I have my needle and thread, and I'm just going to baste on that line just with a little running stitch right on that roll line, just to keep it together so that we can mark it for pad stitching. Now you are going to end up marking that 1/2 inch seam allowance all around and trimming your canvas off, so you want to make sure you're giving yourself some room to do that. I already tacked it too far or too close to the edge, but it's okay, I will fix it. Leave that 1/2 inch seam allowance alone, and that way I can trim it off later. So there we go. And again, you're going to want to thread up several needles in order to do all the pad stitching here. You can see on my right side I have my roll line marked now, and it's basted on. So I have started marking my seam allowance line, so I'm just marking 1/2 inch all the way around so that I know not to pad stitch into that area. And I'm just gonna go, this is a straight edge here, and this is a straight edge here. And this is not, this is a curve. So you're gonna keep going all around. And then if you like, you can fill in that gaps where you can keep measuring to get an exact line all the way around. So when you're pad stitching, you're folding that fabric over your hand, and you're going to lose some of the fabric on the you're going to be bending it and manipulating it, which is going to force that melton on the back out, and so you will end up cutting off some seam allowance, or when you cut off the seam allowance, it won't be in the same spot it was before. So you want to just make sure that you're pad stitching it so that it forms that curvature, and it automatically does this on its own so that it has that shape around the neck. But you'll be, the way that you're manipulating the fabric causes you to shift the one piece so that it's bigger, and then your seam allowance changes. Okay, so now I've marked my seam allowance, and I've marked my roll line, I basted it. Now I'm going to mark where I actually want to pad stitch. So in general, the undercollar is pad stitched in little arcs about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch apart. So you would start here at the center back, and then that would become one arc. Sorry, I'm just checking to make sure that that's off a little bit with my arc there. Okay, so my center's here, even though, so I'm just marking my center so I can see that I'm making my arcs even, and then I'm just going to arc it around like this. Okay, so, and I'm not measuring, I'm just eyeing it, but if you feel more comfortable being a little bit more exact and measuring that, you can. Okay, and then once you get that to the seam allowance line, you're just going to break it and come back down the other side as if it was continuous, and then you're just going to keep going. So my arcs my lines are getting a little wider, so I'm going to just stick to one side for a little bit. And then you're going to, when you get to the tip, again, you can reduce your width down a little bit. So like we did on the lapel, or I showed you how to do that on the lapel. So you're going to down to 1/4 or a scant 1/4 inch on that lapel, or on that collar point. And then same thing here. So you're gonna start out with your 3/8 or fat 1/4 inch, and then when you get closer to about here, we're gonna make them smaller and smaller. Now there's a lot of markings going on here, so you might get a little confused with it all, so you will find that you'll probably have to go back and remark your notches in that point, and that's fine. So and then I'm just going to go smaller, and then if I can squeeze one in there, I will. Okay, so again, just make sure you have several threads ready to go. I recommend you have your thimble on, because you're going to be doing a lot of sewing here. So, and you want to just take, now this is going to be a lot easier to show you how good you can do with your pad stitching and not showing through the back side, because I actually have a piece of wool. Now this is my center back seam, so I can easily go through the fabric and not catch or not have my stitching show on this part. but as I get off the seam, it will be more likely to show. So I'm just pricking it ever so slightly, so that's gonna show there. So you can see the little glint of needle there. So I need to back that off and not have it go so deep. Sorry, lost sight of my camera. Yeah, so I do have one that shows, but then my next one does not. So really focus on your stitches so that they don't show on the right side. So I should be coming down this line now. Next spot. Untwist my thread a little bit. Yeah, so I have a pucker there, but not any thread or needle showing, and that's fine. And one thing I want to stress is don't pull your stitches too tight. You want, if you do that quite tight, then you can end up with it just looking really tight and unsightly. So you want to make sure that you're keeping it a little bit loose. Too much. It's hard to see on the camera, so I'll zoom out a little bit so I can see better. I really want to just try to make sure that it really does roll a little bit as you're going. So now I'm being a little lazy here and doing this all in one arc. Some people like to do 1/4 and 1/4 at a time, just to really make sure that they get a definitive roll on their roll line. So my red is my stitching or my seam allowance, and so that's where I'm going to stop and then jump over to the next line and keep going this way. Alright, so I'm going to pause the video here because I think you get the hang of this, and then I'll meet you back when I get a little closer to the collar points, and I'm going to keep going from there. So I'm getting close to a corner here, and I'm just going to make my stitches a little bit smaller, a little bit closer together. And I also wanted to point out, like just like we did before when we were running out of thread on the lapel, you're just going to tack your thread with a couple of stitches in the exact same spot, and then continue on with a new thread doing the same, tacking it in the exact same spot, and then continuing. So I find that when I'm pricking through or poking through, if I feel that on a thick fabric like this, if I feel that needle on the other side, I've gone too far. So you want to feel the pucker, but you don't want to feel the needle. So just a little side note there, because yes, some fabrics, the thinner fabrics, you might go through more readily, but if you're really feeling that needle touch you on the other side, you've gone too far. You just want to feel that it's pulling the fabric, not actually poking through. As I can show you here in a second, there's a few that I just let them go, went ahead and so especially here in the center when I was getting started, you can see these little stitches, at least I hope you can see them. Bring it a little closer. So you can see those stitches more readily than over here where I was just letting it just barely go through, and then that created it's attached here, but it's not poking through. So then you can see that it already is curling and is no longer flat. Like you can see that it definitely has some shape, starting to take shape, more so than on this side, and it's got a bit more stiffness and rigidity, which gives that nice crisp collar look, versus this side, which has not been secured with anything. So I'm just going to keep going, but I wanted to point out those two little things. So just pick up where I left off. And I strongly recommend waxing your thread if you have beeswax. When you get to the end, so I have 3 rows to go, just give that an extra bit of curl around your finger. This will really ensure that the collar wants to stay flat against the body rather than curl up and stick out. So just really curling that around my fingers. I don't know if you can see how much curvature I have there going on, but really bending it to get that shaping in place. All right, and I think that's good enough, so I'm going to tack it there. And trim my thread. Okay, so I've got a little bit more than half done, so I think I stopped around there, so I still have this to do, but you can see that I can easily get my finger under there without moving the fabric. It's definitely got some roll starting to take shape versus this side, which is still flat on the table. Okay, so I switched to a slightly darker color here, so hopefully you can see this better. So I've continued to pad stitch in up and down my arch here, curling it around my hand as I go, and then you hopefully can see that I've barely got any of those pink ones going through. Occasionally I did, but I just have my corner here to do, so again I'm going to really curl it over my hand, but the whole thing is starting to take shape nicely, and then we'll take it to the iron and press it. So here is the finished pad stitching for that collar. So again, it's got some shape on both sides here. So, and then we'll continue to encourage the shaping at the ironing board. So give this a baste where you're going to fold it right on that rolled line, and then you're going to take it to the ironing board and press it. Now, when I do that, I'm going to lose all of my iron off pen marks. So I'm going to go ahead and trim out my seam allowance now so that I don't lose those. So from the Melton edge, I want to mark my seam allowance because it's changed ever so slightly in some areas. So I'm going to be measuring from the Melton and cutting on that line. Okay, so maybe it would be a good thing if I lost my marks and then redid it, but for the sake of the video, I'm just going to go ahead and mark it now. And just going to trim this back so I can see where the wool is, so I can measure from that. Caught on the seam allowances underneath, so let's fold that back. Now I can truly see what I'm doing. So again, I'm measuring from the wool, not the canvas, to get a better idea of where I'm cutting this off so that I have a true 1/2 inch seam allowance line all the way around. End of the curve side. Now I'm going to go to the straight side. So this doesn't look like it's changed that much, but this has changed a bit. And it's okay if you haven't pad stitched right to the edge there, and that will be fine. So okay, so I'm just going to trim right on my blue line. So like I mentioned, I'm going to lose all my arc markings when I press this, so you won't be able to see the white ones on this side, but you'll still be able to see the pink ones on that side. So you're going to just baste this down right on that roll line and give it a good firm press at the ironing board. So let me just baste this now. I'm just coming over to this side because it helps me maintain that curvature as I'm basting. And you're going to be pressing this around your tailor's ham again. And just do your back stitch. Take that up. Okay, so you can really see now that with it basted, it's actually standing up on end, right? Okay, so I just curled this right around my ham, and I'm going to take my iron and then just press this all the way around here, all the way around here, and then that way it will take the shape of a curved round neckline versus a flat straight collar pattern. Give it some time to dry before you pull your iron away. And then repeat on the other side. Just holding it until it cools off a little bit. Okay. Now you can see it really is curved and nicely shaped. Now, in the tailoring book, it talks about how much it curves depends on what style of shoulder you have. So a deeper curve, square shoulders. This is more in between, and then this is your sloped shoulders. Okay, so I'm going to just go kind of in between. Here, letting the heat set that in place. So I'll do the same thing at the top of this piece. So this is again when you're using that bias to shape and construct this into a shape that is more flattering on the body. So this will be your undercollar, it will go like this, and then your fashion fabric will go on top of that. So like this. Okay. All right, so now this is ready to be pinned in place and sewn onto our jacket.